Hi everyone, we're about to get started for the webinar. Just to give you a few notes of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the question box. Please don't use the chat box, but really the question box. And if we can, we'll answer them just kind of via text, back and forth, or we can ask them at either the middle or the end of the webinar. So feel free to ask questions as they come up during the webinar, and we'll answer them, and our presenters will answer them at the end of the webinar. And this recording and the slides will be available afterwards. They'll be posted on our website, and we'll also send it to you in an email that comes usually 24 hours after the webinar. So no need to worry if you miss something. It'll all be a recording available afterwards to everyone. So we're really thankful that you're here and glad to get going, and I'll turn things over to Elayne.
Thank you, Sarah. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding webinar today on getting the message right, how to stop Trump's proposed cuts to affordable housing. Today, the President's budget, his 2018 budget, leaked, and it pretty much incorporated everything that we were worried about, extreme cuts to affordable housing and community development programs that really put thousands of families at risk of housing insecurity and homelessness and increased poverty. So we thought that in order to, fight these budget cuts, that we would put on a webinar for you to learn what messages really resonate with lawmakers and the public. So a little bit about CHCDF. CHCDF is an educational strategy and action hub for national organizations that are dedicated to preserving and expanding federal resources for affordable housing and community development programs. Our members represent the full continuum of national housing and community development organizations, and those include faith-based organizations, nonprofits, private and public sector organizations, and advocacy groups. So we have quite a busy agenda today, so we're going to hop right into it. And our speakers today are Rebecca Vallas and Jeremy Slevin from the Center for American Progress, Tiffany Manuel from Enterprise Community Partners, and Amy Clark from the National Housing Conference. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca and Jeremy now to go over their new research that they've done on messaging around the budget.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for having us on. It's great to be chatting with you guys. I wish it were under better circumstances, but this week and next week are going to be what they're going to be. So as was just said, the Trump budget is expected for Tuesday, May 23rd. The congressional budgets are expected in June, although that could slip, especially with all of this Russia stuff continuing to unfold. And specifically within the housing context, thanks to some of the leaks that we've seen, we are seeing confirmation of what we expected, which is that the budget will include major cuts to a range of critical programs for struggling families, including affordable housing. We saw in the leak elimination of CDBG like we had seen in the skinny budget, as well as cuts to home and other critical programs, and all to pay for the tax cuts for wealthy families as well as corporations. So a little bit on what we're expecting to talk about today on CAP's end. We did some message research that I'm going to speak about in some level of detail, as well as kind of key takeaways from that research for how we talk about the budget. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jeremy Slevin, who leads the poverty team's advocacy work at CAP, to talk about a new campaign that we're launching next week called Hands Off, which is all around the budget, and he'll have some specific information about how you guys can plug in. So next slide, please. So a little bit of background on the message research that we did and why we did it. Following up on November's election, I think there was broad awareness on the part of progressives that we were not, one more next slide, please. Thank you so much. I think there was broad awareness that we were not reaching a lot of the folks that we thought we were reaching, folks who feel left behind economically, who feel that the policy agenda has not been speaking to them. And so we at the Center for American Progress partnered with some of our pollsters and message gurus to take a look at what messages could be more effective at reaching folks who are feeling left behind, and who could be persuaded and sort of through explanation understand that the policies that progressives are pushing are for them and speak to them. So what we did, I won't read to you what's on this slide, but we did a combination of focus groups as well as online qualitative board discussion, and then we followed that up with a nationally representative poll. For any polling nerds on the webinar, please feel free to reach out. Our contact information is actually in the last slide of this presentation. We'd be happy to share a little bit more detail about what we did and how. I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of these slides, and for time purposes actually asked to skip a couple of them so that we can get to the good stuff, which is what does this tell us about how we should talk about the budget. So if we could advance 2 slides, please. So a little bit on this, pulling up a note. Most voters still identify as middle class, but working class is close behind. Most voters across race, age, and income lines in our research define themselves as middle class, but the picture of middle class life that they had painted was hardly an idyllic one. So in their minds, middle class has transformed from a life of comfort and advancement to one of barely getting by, with increasing economic as well as quality of life compromises. We found broad agreement in our research that what used to be a significant difference in quality of life and economic security between the middle class and the poor has shrunk dramatically. The difference between the two, our research indicated, is sort of more circumstantial, a medical crisis or a lost job causing harm, than it is about personal differences in work ethic or education, sort of what you end up hearing from conservatives and some in the media. But bottom line, most voters do not view messages or programs targeted to, quote, the poor as speaking to them or about them. And our key takeaway here is that messages must therefore explicitly speak to voters and to Americans more broadly on a more personal level. So families like mine or you and your family, as opposed to language that evokes thoughts of some other person besides them that they're supposed to feel pity or charity for when we're trying to spark people towards advocacy. Next slide, please. So another key takeaway from our research is that despite the submerged state, the idea that a lot of folks don't actually have broad awareness about what types of government programs they're actually helped by, lots of folks do have a personal connection and are aware of and ready to share about a personal connection that they have to government assistance programs. Maybe this is not a surprise to a lot of folks participating in today's discussion. The recession is not that far behind in the rearview mirror, and a lot of people remember personal connections to perhaps assistance that they or their families received when they were facing foreclosure. Likewise, 70% of Americans will turn to some means-tested safety net program at some point in their lives. So not a total surprise, but I think really positive findings here from the standpoint of people really understanding in greater numbers, and including white non-college folks, that they have personal connections to government assistance. Now, if I could bump ahead 2 slides, please. So a couple of takeaways from our research about the political environment. The thing to know here in this slide is, yes, there's broad, intense dissatisfaction across the board with leadership in DC. DC policymakers, particularly federal policymakers, viewed as deeply unpopular. But, next slide. By and large, voters don't expect Trump and the GOP to march in lockstep. And I think this is particularly important to understand. Many of the folks that we spoke with expressed the belief that Trump has little in common with congressional Republicans. They see him as sort of an anti-politician whose candidacy was a rebuke to the establishment in both parties, kind of a different guy who marches to the beat of his own drum. And so as a result, you end up with lots of folks expressing little concern about runaway partisanship or a lack of checks and balances in the Republican agenda. And messages that encourage Trump to stand up to his party are seen as unnecessary or not really resonating with folks because there's an existing expectation that he's already inclined to do so. This is a particularly important takeaway because it underscores the work that we have to do and the opportunity that we have at hand when it comes to Trump's budget release next week. This is a core opportunity for us as progressives to help educate the public, including Trump voters, particularly Trump voters who swung from having voted for Obama once or twice in previous elections, to help them understand that Trump is not that guy that they think he is, but rather he is marching in lockstep with congressional Republicans, and his budget is Exhibit A of how he's not for the forgotten man and woman he campaigns to fight for, but rather wealthy millionaires and billionaires like him and his cabinet. I'm going to skip the next 2 slides, please. So with this slide, the key takeaway is that, yes, the Republican dependency message has been popular for a long time, and it remains somewhat popular when you actually test it on its own. But we can beat it with the right message. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about this in sort of the takeaways section toward the end of my presentation in just a little bit, but one of the most interesting takeaways we had from this message research was that the term safety net is not something that people are familiar with. In fact, in focus groups, it actually evoked blank stares from a lot of the participants, or it didn't mean something that was meaningful or personal that resonated with people who we spoke with. A term and an overall message that was much more effective, that really did connect with people, and that actually beat that Republican dependency message was more about basic living standards. The government should ensure that all families have access to basic living standards like health care, nutrition, and housing if their wages are too low or they can't make ends meet. That beat by a large margin the Republican message of welfare programs trap people in poverty by leaving them dependent on the government and penalizing work. Next slide, please. So another spin on this message that also works effectively, that resonates with people personally, is more about when times get tough. Even if I may not need them now, I'm glad that our society provides government services to ensure basic living standards for when times get tough. Again, this beats that conservative message. I don't envision ever being in a position where I would need or want to use the health care, nutrition, housing, or income support offered by the government, kind of that stigma-based frame that we often hear both from conservatives and from the media. I'm going to skip the next 3 slides and get into the good stuff with the specifics of Trump's budget. So when we took a look at what people felt about Trump's budget when we asked them initially about it, so would you support or oppose an economic plan to increase spending on our military and homeland security and to cut taxes across the board, including income taxes on individuals and corporate taxes, sort of a neutral statement about Trump's budget. Support for it was below 60% at the outset, but next slide. The way that we were able to get from not necessarily supporting it, but to actual outrage and to clear opposition was about trade-offs. Trade-offs were the key to spurring opposition as well as outrage. And what do I mean by trade-offs? It's not just about educating people about what's in the budget, how it will impact them and their families and their communities. It's about what those cuts are to pay for, and they're to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. It's that sort of evoking a clear villain. Going back to the idea of how people identify and whether they identify as middle class, working class, or poor. As I said before, very few people identify as poor. However, without evoking that clear villain of where these program cuts are actually being made in order to pay for something that benefits other people, like the wealthy and corporations, we leave sort of a vacuum where people can find their own villain, and the table that we set from the campaign in many ways in November was that the villain is that person one rung down the economic ladder, someone who people feel is getting there, sitting on the couch, eating bonbons, the Fox News conception of who's poor. Really important to evoke that clear villain. It's to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, so that people are not instead thinking that they're the ones who are being hurt because somebody else below them on the economic ladder is being helped. Next slide, please. And actually, I'll skip that one and move ahead to effective messages. And if I could skip to the slide that has a header that says oppose and propose. Another key takeaway from our message research is that helping people understand what the cuts do, how they affect them and their families is very effective, but the absolute kind of secret sauce that takes it one step further is not just to critique the proposals and help people understand how it would hurt them and their families, but to actually then pivot to a message about what we're for. And we call that oppose and propose. So it's not just about helping people understand that cutting access to basic living standards would hurt them maybe through taking away affordable housing, but rather that instead of cutting people's access to basic living standards like affordable housing as the Trump budget would do, we should enact stronger policies to create jobs, raise wages, invest in education, and give people a chance at a better future. That's the kind of oppose and propose magic message that helps people go from not just good support, but incredibly strong support. Next slide, please. One of the most exciting takeaways from this message research was that one of the most difficult battles we've been facing as progressives for a long time, and one of the most difficult battles that we've been bracing for in the context of this particular budget fight, and I'm referring to work requirements, the idea of adding work requirements into public assistance programs like we see in TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And I should note, given the focus on housing today, this is definitely one of the things that we've been most worried, we at CAP, as well as a lot of our allies across the poverty and economic justice world, have been most worried about seeing proposals, whether from Trump or from his colleagues in Congress. Speaker Ryan, in his Better Way agenda back in June of last year, had called for adding work requirements into affordable housing programs and modeling them after TANF, perhaps in combination with a block grant and sending it to the states. That work requirements piece has, as many of you know very well, been one of the stickiest wickets for us to contend with. And we're incredibly excited that as part of this message research, we have found a message and honed a message that actually beats that conservative work requirements message by a long shot, by about 20 points. And so that effective message for beating back this work requirements piece is cutting off people's basic living standards by taking away their health care, affordable housing, and disability support, for example, only makes it harder for them to get back on their feet. Rather than punishing people who are already facing economic hardship, Congress should instead focus on policies that help create jobs and boost wages. So you can see that oppose and propose combination modeled in this message. This is effective in beating back that conservative message of how requiring people who receive government assistance to find work is critical to promote self-sufficiency, prevent abuse and dependency, and ensure that benefits are going to those truly in need. Work requirements protect taxpayers and help lift up individuals trapped in a cycle of poverty. That message gets beaten out by our basic living standards, oppose and propose. I'm going to skip to the next slide. I'm going to skip these next few slides, but I would love to stick with each for just a couple of seconds so that folks can see what's on here. As part of this message research, we also tested a battery of progressive proposals to help arm us with numbers as well as kind of an idea of what's most popular as we do that oppose and propose jujitsu. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of housing-related messages. So one in the top tier that we found that was incredibly popular with 75% total support was helping first-time homebuyers by offering low-interest rate mortgages and directing funds to help them make a down payment on a home. In the second tier of policy solutions, still with incredibly strong support, 65% overall total support, expanding rental assistance for low-income families who are spending more than half of their income on rent each month and are therefore cost-burdened. And I'll continue to the next slide. These are our policy proposals that have incredible support across party lines. So no matter who folks were voting for in November, these are the kinds of policies that retain tremendous support, even now post-election, post-inauguration, and they're the ones that do incredibly well when it comes to that oppose and propose pivot. So I'm going to close with a couple of slides on key takeaways and specific message guidance around the budget, and then I'm going to hand things over to Jeremy, and then we'll take questions. So if I could be on the slide that says key takeaways and message guidance. So a couple of key things, some of which I've hit on in broad strokes, but that if you remember nothing else from today's discussion, this is kind of the money shot. Voters don't expect Trump and the GOP to march in lockstep, and the budget is a key opportunity to show whose side Trump is really on. It's not the forgotten man and the forgotten woman. It's millionaires and billionaires, and that's who his budget helps. It's time to move away from that pity and charity framing. We need to be emphasizing how proposed cuts will affect you and your family, threaten your family's economic security. Safety net is an unfamiliar term for most people, and so basic living standards, or a shorter version, the basics, these are terms that resonate incredibly effectively, and people say, yes, that's me, that's my family. This is going to sound like common sense, but again, supported by this research, and always a good reminder, important to avoid jargon and acronyms, and even actually specific program names where we can, with certain exceptions. There were a handful of program names that people absolutely know and are familiar with. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Meals on Wheels are some notable examples, but much better and more effective to talk to people about programs that enable families to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, legal services that help them avoid foreclosure and eviction and so forth, kind of kitchen table terms. Next slide that says key takeaways, please. Again, the importance of naming villains and highlighting trade-offs. This is that special sauce to take the outrage from one level and raise it up to the next. So it's not just slashing affordable housing, it's slashing affordable housing to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. Another notable takeaway that I haven't mentioned, but just to flag, we found that disability is an especially powerful lens. It really helps ratchet up that outrage even among Trump voters. So highlighting the impact of cuts to affordable housing on people with disabilities, for example, a very effective lens. And then oppose and propose, as I said, resistance alone is not going to win the day the way that we would like it to. We need to maximize our potential support and opposition to these policies by ratcheting up that outrage, by not just opposing, but also proposing, pivoting to those big ideas on jobs, on wages, on economic security, on housing. And this approach, again, is successful at beating even the toughest of messages, such as the Republican work requirements message. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeremy Slevin, and if you could go to the next slide, please. It says hands off.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining. So coming out of this polling and messaging research that we did, we thought, what are we going to do about it? And as many of you know, there is a budget coming up that we just got information on next Tuesday, and based on that, next Monday, we are launching a campaign called Hands Off. So what is Hands Off? It is a national campaign dedicated to preventing cuts in everything from affordable housing to Medicaid, disability benefits, nutrition assistance, and other basic living standards. As I said, it's going to launch next week around the budget release. We'll go live Monday afternoon, and it will follow with a big social media push on Tuesday. And the core goals are, A, to put a human face on these massive cuts, and to more importantly, ultimately show that these cuts have giant political consequences. And our short-term goal, of course, is to stop any budget that cuts these basic living standards. Next slide. So we're launching this with a large coalition, everyone from Indivisible to Organizing for Action, President Obama's former group, Social Security Works, AFSCME and SEIU from the labor world, Coalition on Human Needs, Stand Up America Network, the ARC, National Women's Law Center, the La Raza, Center for Community Change. This is really the largest coalition to come together that we've seen so far in the resistance. Is even larger than the Protect Our Care Coalition because it touches on so many issues. So what exactly is Hands Off? We can go to the next slide. So what we're launching on Monday is a website where people can go to share their stories about how the budget affects them. And we, in addition to the website, we're launching this with a video of a storyteller who was homeless for a time and turned to things like food stamps to help her get on her feet and Pell Grants to help her get through college. She's now a successful writer and author. And we'll also launch this with a social media campaign where celebrities and leaders will be sharing their own stories with photos of how basic living standards have helped them. So the way we're encouraging folks to get involved is to, A, use the Hands Off hashtag when you're already starting now, when you're discussing cuts to the Trump and congressional districts, whether on social media or to your groups. And encourage your followers, and do so yourself, to share stories using the Hands Off hashtag. On the next slide, I'll show you a picture, an example of someone sharing their story of how the budget would affect them. There it is. I'm telling Trump in Congress, hands off cuts to Meals on Wheels to pay for tax cuts for millionaires. And we have a whole host of photos like this that people will be sharing to promote the Hands Off hashtag. And then we'll link to the website, which is handsoff.org, where people can take action. Down the line, we will also have a toolkit where folks can go to directly find out how their congressional district, for example, how many people in their congressional district turn to affordable housing. And there they'll be able to directly contact their member of Congress, whether by phone or on social media or by email, to say, this many people in my district will be affected by the budget. Please oppose any budget that makes these cuts. And we will be connecting the people who come in through our website, all of the storytellers, with these field groups like Indivisible and MoveOn.org, so they can take direct actions to oppose this budget. I think that is it for now. You can go to the last slide, which has our contact information. If you need any information about the Hands Off campaign, if you want more sample social media, if you'd like to get involved directly with the campaign, please reach out to me at jslevin@americanprogress.org. If you have any questions about our research, our polling messaging research, or our policy resources ahead of the budget, feel free to reach out to Rebecca at Vallas at americanprogress.org.
Thanks so much, and we're happy to take any questions.
Sarah, do we have any questions so far?
One question we did have was about, about when we're talking about the opposition. Should we talk about the Trump and GOP as separate entities?
So it's a terrific question, and in a lot of ways, it's sort of the question of the moment, given what opportunities lie ahead with the Trump budget. Given what I had shared about how a lot of folks feel like Trump is not a normal Republican, or that he's not necessarily doing the same kinds of unpopular things that folks in Congress have been doing for a long time, and which folks are familiar with and already have viewed as unpopular, we view Trump's budget as a real opportunity to tie him to congressional Republicans and to try to talk about the two mashed up as much as possible. So we often will say Trump and his Republican colleagues in Congress, and obviously folks who are working with C3 situations or restrictions, you can speak with whatever language you need to, Trump and leaders in Congress, Trump and his colleagues in Congress, but the idea is to connect the two of them as much as possible. It's a great question.
Sarah, do we have any other questions at this time?
We just have a few housekeeping questions, so I'll remind folks that The recording of the webinar and the slides will be available on the NLIHC website, and you'll get them via email. And keep those questions coming in. One that came in just as I was talking is a question about how do we address and include issues like mental health into these conversations.
Another terrific question. So we attempted to test messages that could be effective across the board at very top-line levels, and so this poll and the focus groups did not attempt to get into every specific issue. Mental health was not something that was explored at length, but I personally, and speaking for myself, and I think CAP views this this way as well, mental health is part of a broader conversation about disability. We try not to silo the two conversations and have them separately, and so to the extent that disability is one of the most powerful lenses for not just sparking opposition but also outrage, including among Trump voters, mental health is a key part of that. The recent opioids debate has actually been a terrific opportunity to do this, and so to the extent that Trump and his colleagues in Congress claim to care a lot about the opioid epidemic, meanwhile they're slashing Medicaid, which is an important resource and program for enabling people to access community resources for treatment and for getting back on their feet and dealing with substance abuse. There are other cuts as well, such as the Social Services Block Grant, which provides important resources for addiction and for substance abuse. So there's kind of a lot of different moments in the national conversation where these kinds of things come up in different ways and can be important opportunities, but we didn't test that specifically as part of this poll. That being said, I do a lot of work within the disability world, including with groups that work on mental health, and if anybody wants to contact me personally, I'd be happy to speak offline in ways that are maybe not just specific to this research.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. We've had quite a few questions come in. So thank you. First of all, is a question about when the Hands Off website will be live and when the campaign officially launches.
Sure. The website will be live Monday afternoon. So our soft launch is Monday afternoon, followed by a big social media push on Budget Day, Tuesday.
Great. Thanks so much. And on a related question, with Hands Off, are there any people matching a specific cost of a program and what tax cuts might go to that? So are we getting specific in terms of a cut to this program would mean this much of a benefit to millionaires?
Such a great question. Absolutely something that we are doing a ton of here at CAP as part of this campaign and as part of our response to the budget more generally. I'll give one example with a teaser, so you guys can look for this on Tuesday after we see the budget come out. We expect Trump, like he said in his tax plan, to call for repealing the estate tax, which affects just the top 0.02% of the wealthiest estates in this country. And repealing the estate tax would cost the same as it would cost to feed more than 6 million hungry seniors through Meals on Wheels for a year. It's those kinds of trade-offs that we find are incredibly powerful at getting people to understand not just the human face on the cuts, but also what they are being proposed to pay for and whose side Trump and Republicans in Congress are on.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Another question. Why it seems that all these conversations are focusing on cuts. Have there been considerations to discussions of expanding benefits?
Yeah, another terrific question. So, and I'm really, really glad that was asked. A lot of what we are focusing on, obviously, is educating the public and policymakers and the media about what these cuts would mean, who they would impact, and the kind of toll that they would take. But that being said, the oppose and propose message tactic is what we find is most effective. So it's really critical that we not only critique these cuts and hammer at what they would actually mean and the human toll they would take, we also really do need to make that pivot to what we're for. And so I mentioned a number of different progressive proposals that have wide support and that help people understand, not just understand, but help people move away from Republican proposed cuts to a more progressive agenda that would actually help them and their families. But there are also a range of housing-related proposals included in these slides, as well as lots of others that we didn't test. So really important, not just to critique, but also to make that pivot and be pushing to what we're for.
Great, thank you so much. Sarah, do we have any other questions?
1 second there. We do have a few, and just to let people know, because Amy and Tiffany are going to be talking later in the webinar about kind of a broader conversation about messaging about affordable housing, we're not going to get to all the questions right now, particularly if they're related to that question. But one question we do have related particularly to the Hands Off campaign, how can we, first of all, how can people tell their stories and where should they go about doing that? And how can we encourage people that this really is an effective way to get the message across and to have their voice heard when they tell their story?
Great question. So the simplest way is to go to handsoff.org and input their story and then share that on social media. Once you input your story, there's a button that says share this on Twitter, and you can share that you did it so that other people see it. So the website is handsoff.org. Immediately when you go to it, there will be a story form. It's super simple. You can put in your name, zip, congressional district, and then tell your story. In terms of effectiveness, these stories will be directly given to members of Congress. If it's a supportive member of Congress, they will use them to highlight how damaging these budget cuts are. We already know that House Democrats on Wednesday are going to use these stories in 1-minute speeches, and that's just one way that they're using them off the bat. If it's not a supportive district, we are going to use these stories to place them in op-eds, to direct them to field campaigns in the district to make sure those members are hearing those stories. So it really is, it's starting out as a storyteller collection site, but the goal is to move members, because we found that the best way to do that, learning from the ACA fight, is having real-life people on the ground who will be affected in your district.
And just a quick reminder, don't go to the handsoff.org website just yet. It's going live Monday afternoon is when we expect, in advance of the budget release on Tuesday. But as soon as it does go live, check it out and do all the things Jeremy just said.
All right. Well, thank you again, Rebecca and Jeremy, for your presentation. It raised a lot of good thought-provoking issues. Moving right along to Dr. Tiffany Manuel from Enterprise Community Partners. I will let her get going on her presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm excited to be here. That was a fantastic lead into the more specific conversation around housing. So let me just say that I am a Vice President for Knowledge Impact Strategy at Enterprise. We are a national housing and community development intermediary, which is just a fancy way of basically saying we provide all kinds of resources and assistance to community-based organizations across the country, investors and public and private organizations who are interested in transforming communities across the country in ways that lift up low and moderate income families. So next slide. I just want to say we have been engaged over the course of the probably the last couple of months, certainly before the election started, with a project around reframing the conversation specifically around housing, around this notion of opportunity, and certainly around this notion of community development. And we initiated this research mostly for a couple of reasons, even before the sort of Trump stuff blew up and became this very interesting dynamic. Hopefully this will be a very short chapter in American history that ends very quickly and hopefully less painfully than I think we might be anticipating at this moment. But we started this research for a couple of reasons. One, because we were seeing some opportunities happen at the local and state levels, to some extent at the federal level, but especially at the local levels, opening up in terms of the potential to have a broader conversation around housing. And we were concerned that a lot of those conversations and a lot of those policy opportunities would become transactional and not sort of long-term opportunities for us to change the public narrative around housing, to really get housing into the sweet spot of how people think about what's important in their neighborhoods and communities. And it turns out that, building that base of support over the long term for sustaining housing's presence in the national policy agenda is really tough. It's not easy. So we can have lots of small wins or lots of big wins, but over the long term, if we're not tending to the sort of building the public will, we get stuck in a very siloed place. And so we were interested in figuring out, is there a way in this moment that felt really catalytic, could we in fact advance the thinking, the understanding, the narrative around sort of why housing is critically important to communities across the country. We were also concerned that housing in this sort of larger conversation on opportunity was being left out of that conversation. People talk a lot about jobs, they talk a lot about education, but when it came to housing, they kept going back to these other issues, and they weren't including housing in that conversation. Housing, as you all know, is critically important to the ability of families to make ends meet and to keep a roof over their heads. Right, as I heard the last presenter say, housing is the single largest expense that most families have. It is usually the gateway, at least home ownership, to wealth accumulation. It is the thing that almost brought our economy down in 2009, and yet in these conversations about opportunity, we often get left out of the table. Even in this conversation that's happening now about infrastructure, we are often left out of this conversation about how you build the roadways, the roadmaps to opportunity, we would say, in America today. And so we wanted to figure out a way to get housing back in that conversation in a much more powerful way, to really understand how we take advantage of this moment and capitalize on this opportunity. Next slide. So what you'll find is, I just had up a second ago, the report that came out of the initial work. We partnered with a whole range of organizations. Frameworks Institute is the group that has done the research portion of this for us. But the first part of this research was really trying to figure out what are the ways in which our current existing messaging is backfiring, the ways in which we are not able to connect with folks who may not always believe what we believe. And so if we imagine that the work that we need to do in communities across the country requires us to build a bigger tent, it requires us to now have conversations with folks who may not believe what we believe, who may not believe housing is a right, who may not believe food pantries are necessary, who may not believe government should be involved in a whole range of activities that help low and moderate income families, that we have to figure out a way of countering some of those messages. And so the first phase of this work was really figuring out what are the ways when people push back on this housing conversation, they're able to do that. And I won't go into the research specifically. The papers on the website, you can certainly download that. I'm happy to talk with people offline about the quality of and the rigorousness of the social science behind this. But essentially what I want to just share with you is that what we found is when people did push back on housing specifically and the importance of it, there were 6 ways they tended to do that. I won't go over those in detail today, mostly because just in the interest of time. But I will point out a few that I think are particularly pernicious and just difficult for us in these current conversations. The first one is really the one at the very top, what we call the mobility, personal responsibility, and self-makingness backfire. And you all know this. So hopefully I won't share with you that I won't surprise you when I say a lot of folks push back on us because they say people should take personal responsibility for their own lives. But what I think is the nuance here that's really important for us to understand in terms of our messaging is that when people push back, there is an automatic assumption about mobility. So one of the things that comes back consistently is that people should just move, right? If they can't afford to live in the cities where they are, in the communities where they are, that they should pick up their stuff and move. Consistently, that comes back from folks. And I want to say that that's not just by mistake. It's not that they're landing on that language consistently by mistake, and that is common, whether you're talking about Chicago, D.C., San Francisco, consistently we're seeing that pushback. It's coming because there is a broader sort of national narrative, historical narrative around mobility in this country, right? The country was the nostalgia that we like to talk about in this country, that people came to this country because they were seeking a better life. They moved here. They moved to the East Coast. Lots of folks, when they didn't feel like those communities reflected what they wanted, they got in wagons and they hitched the wagon and they sort of went out west. That narrative of mobility is extremely dominant when you talk about this notion of where you live and what are the issues there. When that narrative connects with this notion that housing is considered to be a consumer good, so when we talk to folks, they don't think of housing as a public good in the way that they see education and even to some extent job assistance and some of those kinds of issues. They see housing as a purely private good. What that means is the same way that you would go out and buy a car, right, is the same way they think you select your housing. And that is challenging for us because they don't see their role in helping you buy a car. And in fact, they say, if you can't afford to buy the Maserati, right, then you don't get the Maserati. And when they talked about housing, DC, LA, Atlanta, those are the cities that are the quote unquote Maserati cities. If you are low income or moderate income, the places where you can afford to live, the Kansas City, Missouri, the Alaska, the South Dakotas, the places where wages are more in line with the prices of housing, those are the cities where you can afford, and it's your personal responsibility to move. But what you don't do is buy, essentially, right, a high-priced apartment or living arrangement in a high-priced city and then ask the public to pay for it. And so the challenge for us is a lot of our language reinforces this notion of that. We talk about the housing market. We talk about people's choices. We talk about the fact that people pay too much for their housing, and it reinforces that very notion. So I think, I won't go through all the different backfires, but I think there's a lot of ways in which we consistently see this kind of backfire coming at us. And I think that probably the most important thing I want to say about these backfires are that you are not going to talk anybody out of that. One of the things we know from lots of years of social science, that there is no sort of message that directly confronts that's going to beat that conversation, because there's always a counterpoint, right? You can always say, yeah, there are jobs that you can get in Kansas that allow you to make a decent living, that you probably could get a better life in a different place, right? So anytime there's even one counterpoint, it's hard to really come back on that kind of conversation. And when people can push back in that way, it's hard to win that conversation. So what I would say about that is, when we look at these backfires, it's not that we're trying to figure out counter messages to directly dismantle those. It's figuring out what helps people to get up and over that without having to have an argument about kind of what these backfires are. Next slide. So what we've done in the research is not just to leave you hanging with all the things that are going to backfire on you when you go out to talk about housing and to rate and uplift the importance of that for communities. What we've done in the report is to also list up what we think are 10 very specific redirections, where if you begin to incorporate these redirections in your message, and you can help people to get up and over them. Now, will this change the shape of every conversation, right? There are folks who are just hardcore, right, and they are not going to come along. But the thing about this is there are lots of folks, right, what we call the sort of observable middle of the road, the folks who are not really, they're not the left, they're not on the right, they're kind of in the middle, they hold very disparate views about issues. For those folks, right, and most Americans are somewhere in the middle, it is possible to get people to understand the value of housing and to really think about the narrative very differently. So what I thought I would do is just take a couple of these and talk about the extent to which we as housers are lining up with some of the redirections already, and where are some of the areas where we could actually grow in terms of these recommendations. Next slide. So this came from the early phase of the research, where we specifically looked at media content analysis. We looked at what the media was reflecting that we would say is good practice in terms of framing and communicating messages, and then also where housing materials. So we looked at the 20 largest the 20, I think, most prolific housing organizations that are constantly sort of in the news, that are constantly pumping out new materials and trying to essentially change the public course of the narrative around these issues. And so, surprise, surprise, one of the things we find consistently is that our solutions are fantastic. We are hitting it out of the park. A lot of them, when we do have messages both that appear in the media, and the materials that we send out tend to be highly solutions focused. And I would say they tend to be highly policy focused, which is very helpful, right? Because that's an issue that, for a lot of social issues, when people message about those things, they have lots of problems that they bring to the table, but they don't always have concrete solutions about how those things can be solved. So that I would say is the good news of the story. The part of the story that gets a little complicated are the other parts of the story that really matter. Are we bringing forward causal explanations, the ability to help people really understand, why is this happening? Why are so many people now experiencing housing insecurity? What are the broader impacts beyond just saying that somebody has a house? What does it affect that's beyond just housing? And then what's the value? What's the value of closing the gap? So many people are having housing issues, but what's the value to everybody when this gets solved, right, in our communities? And what you see on that is that there's a little bit of a complicated story, but room for improvement significantly in almost all three of those. So I'd like to just, maybe in the interest of time, take one or two of those and talk about what we're seeing in terms of kind of existing messages, how that is challenged, and then maybe some alternatives that can help you begin to sort of turn that around. So next slide. So this is something that you might often, so first of all, I'd say, from the general public's vantage point, they're not coming with a whole lot of information and a whole lot of background in housing. So most of the time, they reason with what you give them in the frame. So whatever you say, they begin to try and work with that, right, given what you have. And often in our messages, we'll have something like this. Next. We'll say something like more than 11 million renter households are severely cost burdened, meaning they're paying 50% or more for their incomes, of their income for housing. We certainly say this a lot, and are rethinking the way that we talk about this in this way. Next. What I'll say about that, it's a trap, right? Saying that is a trap, it backfires. Next. And the reason it backfires is because it evokes that mobility backfire. What people will say is, yep, exactly, those poor people are making poor choices. The reason they're poor, in fact, is because they don't know how to manage their money. And so if they were better money managers, they would not be in the circumstances that they're in. And so a data point that's meant to share just how many people are dealing with this issue now becomes a reason why they are pushing back. Next. So a redirection is to step back from that, right? To say something like, you know, our paychecks are not getting bigger, but the rents are, pushing many of our neighbors out of our community. Many of the neighbors who are leaving have been longtime residents of this community who watched their children grow up here. They've gone to church here. They've played with their children in our parks. And now, after making those contributions to our community, they're being edged out. We can really do better. So why does that work better than the other data point? And the reason it works is because it redirects attention away from this issue of individual agency, whether or not you're working hard or making good decisions with your financial, right, and defines the problem as structural, and it gets at that kind of causal explanation. You'll also notice that I'm not saying housing. One of the recommendations we have in the report is that housing as a term is tough for us. Doesn't go very well when you talk about housing. We are definitely a housing sector, but when you're talking to the general public, nobody lives in housing. They live in homes, and so that connection is really important to make. Next. So let me give another example. Next. We often say America has an affordable housing crisis. You might know it from you might not know it from our national dialogue. We don't like to talk about poverty and homelessness and lack of opportunity. Next, but I will say that it is a trap. Right? And it's a trap because it evokes this crisis, this fatalism. That crisis talk is really tough for the general public. That may have some resonance among policymakers who want to know what that means when you say crisis, but that crisis talk from the public vantage point actually depresses agency. People are less likely then to want to engage when you talk about our issues in terms of crisis. Next. A better way to say that, and I just picked Denver as an example. In Denver, we're a can-do city. We're building a new reality for our people, a new future for our children, a new model of healthy communities, and providing great places to live, no matter how much money you have in your wallet. That starts with providing quality homes for people who need it. So why is that better? Why is it working? It works because it plays off of a narrative that is very popular and that has a lot of that carries a lot of weight for Americans. We love this value of American pragmatism, that we are a can-do group. We in Denver, or we in Chicago, or we in this, we can do it. It increases a sense of agency. It has a future orientation. It's optimistic. Why is that important? It's important because our brains are actually wired for optimism, right? Scientists have done a lot of work in neuroscience to know that we're actually wired for that. This is a message that pulls people in. It makes folks excited about what's possible. And then you're saying, and yeah, we have this huge challenge. It's not a crisis, a challenge, but we can solve it. And so the other message is depressing. You do want to talk about poverty. You want to talk about homelessness, lack of opportunity. And so some of that is embedded in that messaging. I'm going to flip a couple more because I know we want to get to the end. How about we flip two? Because just flip past all of that. I'm going to do a couple more of that. And so when we make the case, a part of this, I want to sort of give the narrative for how we sort of stack those together. Starting with the value proposition, your message to start that we all have, why do we all have a stake in this problem? And particularly for policymakers and for the broader public, what is their stake in our success, right? That is the first thing you want to start with. Next. The second part of that narrative is bringing in the sort of explanation, right? Why is this happening? Who is responsible? And that's that causal explanation. It's not happening because people are simply too lazy to manage their money well, right? It's not happening because people are making poor choices. It's happening because of structural issues. It's happening because wages are not keeping up with the cost of housing. It's happening for a variety of those reasons that are beyond kind of individual agency. Next. Then the broader impact. We have a lot of data in the housing sector and a lot of information that we can share both about the benefits of housing beyond housing. So how does investment in housing affect the education of students in that same community? How does it affect transportation? How does it affect a whole range of jobs? We have a lot of data on that now, and so the ability to share that, why the investment in housing is a bigger investment for the broader community is really important. And not only just what investment does, but the cost of inaction. When you don't invest in housing, here's the other cost that you have to pay that is not sort of embedded in the way we think about this issue today. And then finally, next, is those solutions and results. So we really do have proven programs. All the things that are unfortunately slated for, a lot of those programs that are now slated for elimination are things that have consistently sort of proven to deliver benefits across communities, whether or not you're poor or not. And so a part of this is let's talk about the solutions, where it's working and how it's working, and that kind of narrative, starting with the why. Why is this an issue that we have, that everybody has a stake in? The explanation, that is structural in orientation. The broader impacts, how does this affect everything else that you care about, whether that's jobs or education? And then here are the solutions. Here's how this works, finally. Last slide. So there's a lot more information in that existing report and a couple of different papers that are coming out related to the research, but I thought it was useful, even in this conversation, at a moment in which it is really tough for us in the political environment, to step back and say, in this moment, are we building up the reserve? Are we building up the kind of constructive conversation that actually has the ability to move us forward, even after we sort of, hopefully we make it through this very tough time under the Trump administration. I'm going to stop there. You can get the paper on Enterprise website, enterprisecommunity.org.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Again, some really great, useful messages and advice for advocates out in the field. I'm now going to turn it over to Amy Clark from the National Housing Conference. Go ahead, Amy.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Elayne, both for having me here and to CHCDF as well for this invitation. I'm really excited about this opportunity to talk about messaging around the budget. So I'm going to build a lot on what Tiffany already shared with you all, talk about some of the research-backed communications tools that we can use to help short-circuit some of the barriers that we encounter in our advocacy communication, and kind of provide a little bit of a template and a roadmap for developing effective advocacy messages, particularly in thinking about the members of Congress who we're going to be speaking with in this advocacy. You can go ahead and advance the slide. Just briefly about NHC here, I'm sure many of you are familiar with us, but one of the things that we really try to do is provide resources on all kinds of things, but particularly on communications to help the housing community be even more effective at talking about why our work is important and building more support for it. Next slide, please. So Tiffany touched on frames quite a bit in her presentation, and I wanted to kind of back up and talk about that idea a little bit more. Frames are the lenses or the filters through which all of us take in new information. If a word or a phrase that we hear triggers a negative frame, we're going to perceive everything heard within the context of that frame in a negative light. The problem is that our audiences, whether they're members of Congress or family around the dinner table at the holidays, they're all likely to have had different experiences, different life influences, consumed different media, all of those things that create kind of the different lens or frame through which we take in information. So anyone we happen to talk to is going to necessarily interpret information differently from us. So we can't talk to a new audience or to people who aren't part of the housing movement in the same way that we talk to other housing advocates like ourselves and expect to be heard the same way or to be as effective. Next slide, and you can tab through a little bit. I have some bullets here, but we can just go right through. So I want you to think about your first home, maybe your first apartment that you rented. There's one more column here, if you can keep paging through. Think about your first apartment that you rented, maybe the first home that you purchased. Think about what that felt like. What did that mean to you? Was it independence? Was it responsibility, security, a sense of relief? These are values. They're pretty universally held values. When we frame our discussions of funding for housing using universal values like these, then we're going to activate positive associations between shared values and our advocacy, which lays the groundwork for our ask. So instead of diving right in with talk about programs or talking about even just housing specifically, right, we can connect with a variety of different people using values. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you go back one? I apologize. So obviously, when we're doing budget advocacy, we are necessarily talking about the role of government. And in the political and social climate that we're in right now, that can be difficult. There's a lot of people who really don't see government as having a positive role in our lives, and that's something that we maybe aren't going to change on our own, but it's something that we're going to have to contend with. But there are a few things that we can do here. Number one, we need to reaffirm the role of government, reaffirm the mission and purpose of government. It was created by us and for us to do the things we need to do together as a society. It has a real role to play. Second, we want to cue structural thinking. So the government is a systemic and structural way that we solve problems as a society, and that we meet people's needs and the way we meet community needs. And in order to get people to think about government having a role, we want to use language that'll cue that sort of systemic or structural thinking, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. We also want to critique government without undermining it. Obviously, there are times when things aren't going the way we want them to. We see improvements that we want made, but we want to be able to present that critique in a way that doesn't undermine the idea of government itself and play into those negative ideas that people have about government. So this is where we can use citizen manager thinking. We're the caretakers of the system that we created and that we benefit from. We have to be responsible stewards and managers of that system, and we want to ensure that the system keeps working. We don't want to tear it down. So those are a few ways that we can address that. Next slide, please. All right. So one of the best ways to trigger that systemic or structural thinking around housing is to tell landscape stories, and I'll explain a little bit about what I mean here. So stories about individuals, the kind of stories that we often tell when we're trying to do fundraising, really focus on, get our audiences to really focus on the person. And I think Tiffany got into this a little bit in terms of some of the backfires that we see, but telling stories just about an individual can really cause your audience to think about what that person should have done differently, what different choices that person should have made. When you tell a landscape story, you cue systemic and structural thinking. So that individual exists in not just their own life, but they live in a community. They live in a place where there's a housing market that is a certain way. There's a job market that is a certain way. There's a broader economy. You can tell the story of what's going on in that economy. You can talk about what the school system is like. You can talk about the role that the local government or the federal government has in helping or not helping this person in their housing situation and the community at large. When you tell those landscape stories and show the systems and structures that are involved in people's lives, and that have created these situations that, that we have solutions for, you're going to cue that structural thinking, which will help people see that government can actually be a solution. That sort of extra benefit of telling these landscape stories is that it really helps us discover new messengers for our advocacy messages. So there may be a police chief in your community who can vouch for the importance of affordable housing and the role that it's had. Maybe there's a school principal who can tell a story that's useful. But we want to tell these landscape stories so that we can cue this thinking on a structural level. Next slide, please. So Tiffany talked a little bit about kind of where to put evidence and data and numbers in your message, and I think it's really important to emphasize this because our tendency, I think, a lot of times in our advocacy is to really emphasize the data, and we're really bought into the data, and we know almost, a lot of us from really personal experience and really tangible experience of seeing what it means to be one of those renters who is severely cost burdened, right? So those numbers have a huge impact for us because of the frame that we have. When we are communicating with people who have really different frames, and if we don't set up that information, if we don't reframe that data for people, they're going to put their own frame on top of it, and the conversation might not go the way we want it to. The number one issue that we deal with when presenting data and evidence is that very few of us think in numbers. And so we need to be careful to present data in a way that's really visual, that's simplified, use social math to compare the numbers that you're discussing to sort of things in real life to help make the numbers more real and more understandable for your audience. Confirmation bias is a huge issue as well. So when people hear new facts that don't conform with what they already believe, if they're not framed properly, the tendency is going to be to interpret them in a way that supports what they already believe. So it's incredibly important to not go straight out with the facts, but start with values, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I also just want to throw in a caveat about data because I think that if we really rely on evidence as our main advocacy point, we put ourselves at risk of moving goalposts, of people we're trying to convince saying, well, that's not enough or that's not good enough data. So it's not something that we can rely on solely in our advocacy for the budget. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a bit of a different picture of the anatomy of a message, but I wanted to go over this as well. So you're thinking about values, you're cueing structural thinking, and you want to paint that clear picture of what a solution looks like. So there's been some research that's shown that your description of how a policy would work and the positive impact it would have once it's in place should actually really take up the majority of the message. So lead with a sentence or two about values, explain what the problem is, get in that causal statement that Tiffany was talking about, and then devote the bulk of your message to describing the solution, which should include how the program is going to have a positive impact, not just on people in need, but on communities as a whole. And I think the solution statement really relates to that purpose part of the proposed part of the oppose and propose message that Rebecca shared at the top of the webinar as well. Next slide, please. All right. So to put it all together, we can think a little bit about how we really target our messages to the members of Congress we're speaking with. And the first thing we need to do is understand what our members of Congress specifically care about. Chances are that housing isn't going to be the top thing on their platform for most members of Congress that we happen to be dealing with. So take a look at your member's platform, your member's priorities. Take a look at who her donors are. Look at who her key advisors are, or the kitchen cabinet that helped her get elected. Figure out what your member of Congress really has as her top priorities. And then while it's probably pretty likely that your member doesn't see housing as the top priority, the things that she cares about in domestic policy certainly relate in some way to affordable housing, whether it's jobs or education or health or transportation. There's some way that having affordable housing in the community connects to those things and improves the chances of those things being available in your community. So figure out what that connection is, and then create a message that uses values to really connect what your member cares about to affordable housing. Get that supportive evidence in place and make sure that it's digestible and understandable. Make clear what the problem is, and spend a lot of time talking about what the solution should be and what it's going to look like in the community when it's in place. Final slide. All right. So in addition to the report that Tiffany worked on, I would suggest that you check out NHC's Messaging and Framing Toolkit. It's on our website. It has 10 different exercises and more information and all kinds of additional resources if you want to dig in. It goes over some of the topics that I covered here in this webinar and a lot more. I'd also suggest that you check out the recordings of the plenary sessions from Solutions for Housing Communications, a convening that we held last month. Tiffany Manuel is one of the many speakers from the plenary sessions, but you'll get to see tons of folks who are doing this work on the ground and be able to benefit from their expertise and perspectives in how you talk with really different audiences about affordable housing. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, James, do we have any questions?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that part of the presentation. We don't have any questions directly related to this section right now, but everyone that's on the call, if you do have any, feel free to type them into your question box. And of course, if you think of any questions after the fact, you'll have contact information on the slides that we send out to you to get in touch with any of the presenters. We do have a couple of questions that gets back to the messaging part of the presentation. We can turn it out now, or we can move on to the next section of the presentation.
Are Rebecca and Jeremy still on the line?
We are here.
Great. So James.
Great. So a couple of messaging questions then. Let's see. So rental assistance, Section 8, recipients, voucher recipients are often viewed with a sort of a sense of stigma, often closely linked to racial bias. And so one person on our webinar is wondering whether any of your findings get into how we can reconcile with that, how our messaging can combat those that sense of stigma.
Is this a question for Rebecca and Jeremy?
I believe so, but I think it would apply also to Tiffany and Amy as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, I would love to hear from them too. I have to say this whole webinar has been fantastic, and it's been wonderful hearing from all of you guys. A very quick crack at that from Cap. So that's actually a lot of what was in our mind coming on the heels of the presidential campaign, with so much hateful rhetoric, so much of which targeted people of color, immigrants, and really played on decades and really built on decades of very racialized conversations about poverty. So I think our big picture answer is the more that you speak to people about themselves, their families, how Trump's proposed cuts to programs that enable people to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table and so forth are actually going to pose a threat to them and their families. The more that you talk specifically to people themselves, the less that you're talking about some other person, that then the otherizing language is what can often evoke people's thoughts of, insert stereotype or stigma here. So I think that's sort of our big takeaway from our research, particularly, and I really appreciated hearing this so much from the other speakers. We're really at this moment where there's tremendous convergence, not just in kind of a big picture way between people who have identified for a long time as middle class and folks who are more struggling to make ends meet, with 1 in 3 Americans now living paycheck to paycheck, but we're also at a moment where, particularly when it comes to the housing space, people are really understanding and realizing well up the income ladder that affordable housing just is not something we have in this country in the supply and in the numbers that we need. We've got folks who are well up the income ladder facing rents and home prices that they can't afford, particularly in large cities, seeing their adult children moving back in with them. This is something that we heard throughout our research. So housing is definitely a space where we have tremendous opportunities to really harness and take advantage of that convergence by speaking to people directly about something that people really do feel themselves, as opposed to using language that evokes otherizing and what can often be implicitly racialized thoughts.
I'll just add real quickly that one thing we also found is helpful is naming real villains. I mean, Donald Trump was very successful in the campaign in demonizing immigrants, communities of color, and foreign countries as the villains. And when you say, instead of attacking our fellow citizens or people seeking a better life in this country, we need to make sure that everyone has an opportunity, and then pivot to, instead of taking away people's basic living standards like housing and giving millionaires and billionaires a tax cut, we should be making sure they pay their fair share and everyone has an opportunity to live a healthy and happy life, and naming whose side he is really on. It has a way of blunting that anger that can be directed downward towards communities of color and immigrants, and directing it where we want it, which is on corporations who aren't paying their fair share, or Donald Trump and his cabinet, or millionaires and billionaires who are rigging the system. So redirecting the anger we found in our poll is really effective.
So I want to piggyback, this is Tiffany, I want to piggyback on that a little bit as well. I would say from a social science perspective, we know that telling a broader, what I would consider to be a story of us, gets you out of that very racialized and very narrow conversation about those people. So as you were talking about otherizing, I think that's exactly right. And telling the story of us means we often tell stories about those people. We do it because we're trying to give voice to the folks who are struggling. So we say these folks are going to be directly impacted if these programs go out of, right? And we say these folks are struggling hard, these folks are homeless, and then we give voice to that. There's nothing wrong with that. We want to put a human face on the issue that we're trying to combat. The challenge is when both the cost and the benefits are wrapped up in that story of them. The story of us is much broader. So if you're going to tell this story and you're going to tell personal narratives, don't start with the African American story. In fact, that was one of the slides that I flipped through quickly, and I almost wish I put in there. Don't start with the story about Greg and Tanisha, because it coincides with those really well-run, overrun stereotypes about who are the beneficiaries of these programs. Instead, start with the story about a teacher, for example, talking about the fact that she's got so many kids in her classroom that are moving so often she can't keep track of them, right, in terms of like their work and how that is directly impacting not just the quality of education for the student that's moving, but for all the other students in her classroom, because she's got to devote so much sort of remedial attention to the kids who are constantly moving. Then talk about the workers who are not able to get to jobs on time because they are moving so often or in places that are so far out of the city that being able to come inside, right, is a problem. Interview the guy from Starbucks who's trying to get his baristas in at 6 o'clock in the morning, right, to make your coffee. He can't do that, or she can't do that, because these folks don't have a decent place to live in the vicinity of where they work. Then tell the story of Tanisha, or the story of Susan, or the person of Peter, or whoever it is that is having a deep problem, and that could be, in fact, African American, Latino, could be brown or white or whatever. But it's contextualized in a broader conversation or broader story of us. The challenge for us is we think that if we tell the stories of those who are suffering most, then we'll get the sympathy or charity that the people will feel empathetic about those issues. And what happens is when they don't, we don't understand what's happening. So anyway, I can say a lot more about that, but I would say telling a different kind of story is exactly what you need to overcome some of those more racialized views of some of these major programs.
Great. Thank you for that great response. James, do we have any other questions?
We do. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for your thoughts on that question. So connecting your responses there to a point that was raised about what the president said on the campaign trail and sort of on the thought of holding elected officials accountable to the public statements that they make. We have a question about statements that President Trump made on the campaign trail, saying that he will not touch Social Security and Medicare. So a question about how we pick up on notions such as that, when we're talking about advocating around the federal budget, how that can impact our messaging in general around advocacy.
It's such a great question. This is Rebecca. I'll take a first quick crack at that. So it's a really, really important point that, yes, Trump throughout the campaign and then following his inauguration as president has repeatedly promised not to cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, and that Medicaid piece often gets lost in the shuffle. He's already violated that promise on Medicaid with the Republican health care bill. We're anticipating that he'll break the promise on Medicare as part of this budget, but I think perhaps the most powerful opportunity we have next week within the three of those promises is on his violating his promise not to cut Social Security. We are expecting that the budget will include cuts to Social Security disability insurance as well as supplemental security income, two of the core components of our nation's Social Security system. That is going to be a key message that groups like the Center for American Progress will be pushing next week, and it's really important that we create an echo chamber around that. And then just drawing from the message research that we spoke about earlier, broken promises is one of the most powerful and effective themes when it comes to speaking specifically to Trump voters and especially to Obama-Trump voters. So broken promise is definitely something that we should be hammering on next week when he gives us the opportunity with Social Security.
Awesome, thank you. James, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we do. We've got a few more questions that are coming in, and everyone that's still with us on the webinar, please feel free to continue adding in your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we have time for. Of course, we are approaching 4:30 when we're scheduled to end today's webinar, but I will say that all of your questions, if whether or not they were directly answered, will be passed on to all of the presenters for today. So they'll be able to see those and to get back in touch with folks if needed. And of course, also when we give you all a copy of today's presentation slides and a recording, those slides will have email addresses for today's presenters. You can get in touch with them directly if you have a question that we don't get to, or if you think of additional questions after the presentation today. So here is a kind of particular question about framing messaging. A lot of folks want to talk more about messaging and how we can effectively do this as a piece of our advocacy work. So this question comes from someone working for a nonprofit, nonprofit housing developer who receives federal funding to develop housing. And this person wants to know how they can frame their pitch to advocate for expanded funding without it sort of feeling or looking self-serving, given that they are both doing advocacy and receiving that funding.
Yeah, so I'll certainly start with that. I think the message itself doesn't, the architecture of the message doesn't change, whether you're talking to folks whether you're a developer who's got some self-interest in the conversation or not. Right, the issue is how do you frame it in a way that allows folks to see their shared interest or shared stake in what you're trying to do, and that has to come first. If they don't get that, and I think Amy talked about that very well too, if you don't have a shared value at the top of that message, you will not hold them in that conversation. And so the thing for you to think about is what are the things that allow folks to see value in what you're doing in the broader community. We know some of the frames that tend to work. Just you know, out of the gate, our prosperity of the kind of nation or region or community. When you say that the prosperity of this community, the wealth, the resources in this community are dependent on, to some extent, our ability to make sure that people have a decent place to live. And so that's a part of what I'm trying to provide, starting with providing a roof over the head of folks who may not always have ready access to a place to live that's good. So I think really sort of thinking about that value proposition first is probably important. The second thing I would say is, because you do have a self-interest in that conversation, is to get some unexpected or non-traditional messengers to begin speaking on your behalf, and not just the folks who are going to directly benefit potentially from being housed, right, in the area, but as I was saying before, from folks who are unexpected. The guy who manages the Starbucks, the teacher who's in the school, folks who are not traditional speakers on this in the community. When they speak up, people listen because they can't figure out, to some extent, what's their angle, right? And so being able to talk to folks and get folks to speak on your behalf, I think, particularly who are unexpected messengers, I think would be very effective.
This is Amy. To add to all of that, the one thing that I would caution any developer in doing advocacy from that sort of difficult position is just to be careful of lingo and be careful of sort of language that people can see as trying to dress things up. Public-private partnership is, I think, a good example of that. That's a buzzword that everyone, you know, is always really excited about, and it's a good thing. But there are also folks who look at that and say, it's not a partnership, you're making money. And so just be aware of the terminology that you use and the words that you use that can sort of spark that cynicism. And don't try to dress up what you're doing with that lingo in order to shy away from it.
All right. So do our speakers have any final thoughts before we wrap up today's webinar?
Just wanted to say thanks so much for including us. You guys are going to be hugely important messengers in the next week to come, as well as throughout the summer, as we all continue to try to make sure that cuts to affordable housing programs and the rest of the programs that are critical for families, for kids, for seniors, for people with disabilities, and everyone else are not slashed to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. So thank you so much for joining us in this fight, and we look forward to working with you.
And this is Tiffany. I would sort of piggyback on that and say that this is on the housing front, this is a really catalytic moment. There's so much that is queued up right now in terms of just the numbers of folks who especially at the local, state and local level, are very attentive to issues around housing and the development of places and community development. I will just say that there's no better moment to be really conscious and intentional about your messaging, because we have the capacity potentially to build some inroads that will allow housing to stay on the local, state, and national agenda for a while, but only if we get the messaging right. So I would say that if there's ever a time for you to step back and say, is this the way we want to be able to, is this the way that we're not only advancing initial policies right now, but the way that we want to advance a long-term strategy on this is really important. So just being thoughtful about that at this moment is important.
Sure. This is Amy. I will add that I think that we're in a moment where it's incredibly important that we advocate for all of the housing programs, and to the extent that we can really speak for other social service programs and health and that kind of thing. I think it's incredibly important. You know, if we're in a situation where a lawmaker says to us, well, if you want funding for this program, we're going to have to cut something else. That's not a situation where we want to give an answer. We want to make clear that all of the housing programs work together. They work with local housing programs and state housing programs, and they're all an incredibly important part of ensuring that everyone in America has an affordable place to live. So we need to have each other's backs and advocate even for the programs and funding that we may not use in our own work, but we know are important to the communities that we all live in.
Well, that wrapped the webinar up, I think, very well. I want to again thank all of our speakers today for really presenting useful information that we could take back to our organizations and to our fields to share and make sure that we are using these messages effectively with our lawmakers and reaching out to the public at large. So again, thank you all, our audience, for joining as well, and we hope you have a really great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.